Missouri, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation. It's been an honor to have all nations working together. And this evening, I understand it's going to be a very serious topic, interesting, and something that needs to be talked about. I thank each and every one of you for taking the time to come and support what's going on. And thank you to the panel members for being here. A quick prayer and we'll get this event going. Great spirits, thank you for bringing us together this evening. Just guide each and every one of us on the path that we're on, letting us always remember that we are the leaders and the mentors of those who follow us, those who witness what we say and what we do. I ask Great Spirit to take care of our families at home, especially the elders in our communities and the children. Thank you. Just pick the glass out.
Thank you so much, Elder Margaret and Mayor, for starting us off always in a very good way and grounding us in this work. Before we walk through the agenda tonight, I would like to invite Dr. Tim Takaro, who is a professor emeritus at SFU's Faculty of Health Sciences, to provide just a little bit of context for why we're having this discussion tonight. Tim.
Someone on Zoom has it muted.
Thank you very much, Elodie, and welcome everyone. It's certainly my pleasure to be here, and I am anticipating a very interesting evening. At $26 billion and rising, TMX, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project, is the largest public works project in Canadian history. Global carbon emissions from burning fossil fuels is at an all-time high in 2022. After a momentary drop in 2020 that was attributed to the pandemic. Emissions must start dropping to reduce future catastrophes. Yet Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion is slated to add 560,000 barrels per day. This capacity will enable the expansion of the Alberta tar sands. The harsh reality of the project's hidden costs unfolded very early in the conception of the project, when the Harper government refused to consider downstream emissions as impacts of the Trans Mountain project, a stance that has been maintained by the current government. My first slide demonstrates a phenomenon that we are observing, which is really a matter of who's telling the story. So we know that Trans Mountain, I have a way to advance these. We know that Trans Mountain increases carbon emissions. We know that carbon emissions leads to global heating. We know that global heating leads to more weather disasters. And we know that more weather disasters leads to death, disease, and displacement. But what happens is that the media refuses to connect these dots. And they must be connected. Because without making this connection, you can't possibly understand the true costs of the Trans Mountain Pipeline. So I'm really happy that we are getting the opportunity to explore with the panel some of these hidden costs, and I hope you will enjoy the evening, and I will be very much appreciative of your participation and questions as we move through the evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, for providing that context. As we are at the Center for Dialogue, I would like to remind everybody that we hope you're coming here tonight in good spirit and good heart. We would like to share a couple of community guidelines, including for the folks who are joining us online. And we hope you'll commit to these as a way to enable us to have a productive and respectful conversation tonight. So we really invite you to be open to other perspectives and generous of spirit. We can disagree, and this topic has been full of disagreement. Disagreement is normal, but we want to use this as an opportunity to clarify and understand some of the ideas that are going to be presented to us tonight by the panel. We will have an opportunity for questions a little later on in the evening, but we ask that you be disciplined in your participation as to allow space for others to speak. And if you are going to speak personally from the heart rather than in generalities. Be inquisitive, ask questions. That's what we hope to get from this panel tonight, is a lot of thoughtful answers, and really listen to understand and speak to be understood. And most of all, I hope you will commit to being respectful of everybody here in this room or online. We're all humans, and we all deserve respect. So I hope you'll join us in making sure we maintain a good spirit in the room and online. I also do want to apologize. We're experiencing some technical issues. We have some weird sound happening here. Our tech team is trying to figure that out. But as we experiment with these moments online and in person, we'll ask for your generosity as we figure that out. So in a few minutes, we're going to hear from each of the leaders here who will share some opening remarks. And after this first lightning round of discussions, Tim will moderate a little bit of a dialogue and help us understand some of these issues better. And after that, we will use a little tool called Slido. And thank you. Slido is a little tool that enables us to share transparently what the questions are from the audience. So you'll see on the screen. You can go to slido.com using your phone if you're here in the room, and if you're online, you can also use your computer. There's a little code. Strangely enough, we can't see it. So let's see if Melvin can show us the code. Because right now it's a bit of a mystery. There we go. Wonderful. So if you use this code, you'll see on the application, you can type in a question. And most of all, you get a chance to vote on other people's questions. So if you see a question that you like, you can press the little thumbs up button, and that question will come up to the top. So we're going to do this democratically tonight, and we'll take the questions that are at the top of the list. And hopefully that will help us do this as transparently and democratically as possible. This will also enable the folks joining online to be in the room with us, because obviously it's a little harder to ask questions if you're not here. So hopefully everybody is able to do that. And for folks online, Melvin will also add some instructions in the chat if you need that to help you. With that, I think we're all here to hear from our leaders tonight. So we're going to get started right away. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists so you have an idea of who they are. Our first panelist is Marc Lee. He's a senior economist with the British Columbia office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Marc joined the CCPA in 1998 and is one of Canada's leading progressive commentators on economic and social policy issues. Marc led the CCPA's Climate Justice Project, which published a wide range of research on fair and effective approaches to climate action through integrating principles of social justice. Next speaker will be Erin Hansen. Erin is a settler Canadian and works as a manager of the Sacred Trust Initiative, as well as policy advisor of the Tsleil-Waututh Nations in their Treaty, Lands, and Resources Department. Over the past 15 years, Erin has worked for several Coast Salish communities on issues related to Indigenous laws, jurisdiction, rights, title to land, and relations between the Canadian state and First Nations. With Erin, we have Chloe Hartley, who is also settler Canadian working on the Sacred Trust Initiative as a policy analyst. Chloe's background is in ecological restoration, and she has a passion for working with water and plants and people. And Eugene, who's also on the panel, there we go, is a human rights and environmental justice lawyer, currently working as a staff lawyer with West Coast Environmental Law. where he works with the Aboriginal and Natural Resources Law team and with the Revitalizing Indigenous Laws for Land, Air, and Water team. Eugene's work focuses on climate change and energy infrastructure and the intersection between Indigenous and Canadian law. And last but not least, Kevin Cromar is the Director of Health, Environment, and Policy Program at the New York University Moran Institute of Urban Management and is an Associate Professor of Environmental Medicine and Population Health at New York University Grossman School of Medicine. He is a former fellow at the Institute for Policy Integrity at the New York University School of Law, and his translational health research program focuses on the intersection between science and policy. And his work has directly led to improvements in transportation, energy, and health policy in the US and internationally. So to start us off tonight, we will hear from each of these speakers for roughly 3 to 5 minutes before Tim comes back and asks them a couple of questions to get us started. And of course, I hope you will all have many questions to ask as well, and reflections for each of these speakers. So we will start with Marc.
Should I come up or
Oh, you
sit?
can just sit there.
Yeah. All right. Hi, everyone. It's kind of cool to be in a room with human beings. I feel like we haven't done that a whole lot in the last few years for some reason. Well, it's interesting to be here at this particular moment. I was thinking this morning as I was preparing for this talk that it was 12 years ago that when Harper was still in power, Joe Oliver, his natural resource minister, published a scathing letter in the Globe and Mail criticizing eco radicals for opposing the pet projects of the federal government at the time, which was Enbridge's Northern Gateway pipeline. And I feel like that letter set off a firestorm in BC. And I think about like the couple years that followed after that, when what was now the Canadian Energy Regulator was then the National Energy Board came and did their hearings in Vancouver. Hundreds of people showed up, a big protest at the Wall Center. I know some of you were there because you're nodding your heads. And I feel like that was kind of the start of the pipeline wars in BC, that, BC, quiet BC on the corner of the earth, no one thought a whole lot about. And all of a sudden, we have now been on the front lines of the fight against fossil fuels for a dozen years. Northern Gateway, kind of went up and down and was approved and then followed, and there was an appeal and got taken off the table, and with a bit of a bait and switch. And in its place, we got the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. And that's what we've been fighting ever since. And I want to, give a special shout out to folks like Tim Tuccaro, who've been putting their bodies on the line for all of this, and went to prison as a result of that civil disobedience. And such respect for that. So, such a mess was the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. The feds had to buy it in 2018. You guys all know this, and we've since seen insane cost overruns. So back in 2013, at the outset, it was like 5.4 billion, and then it just kind of went up and up and up. When the feds bought it, went up to increase the price to 7.4 billion. A couple years later, it was 12 billion, and as of last year, 21 billion dollars to complete this pipeline, which should be completed, we think, now by the end of the year. As an economist, we try to think about these things in terms of costs and benefits. I did kind of a cost benefit study of the Enbridge pipeline back at the time, but the same logic is basically true. What are the costs and what are the benefits? I think we know pretty well what the costs are. That a lot of the focus has been on the potential for spills, whether at land or at sea. And with the amount of time over the course of decades and the amount of product flowing through, it's really not a question of if there's a spill, but the question is when. And that will have an impact on competing industries, on water, on other species. There will be costs of cleanup that will have to be absorbed. Tim mentioned the carbon cost, that the whole purpose of the pipeline is to facilitate increased production in Alberta to send to the United States and Asian markets. And we know there's a cost associated with that. So my quick calculation is that if the pipeline is as successful as the industry would like, it leads to an additional like 84 million tons of carbon dioxide per year going into the atmosphere. That's larger than BC's annual emissions right now. And economists have this thing they call the social cost of carbon. It's a way of putting a price on the damages associated with emitting an additional ton of carbon. And if you add that into the mix, it ends up being about $17 billion per year in damages that would be caused by the pipeline. Now, the pipeline may not run at full capacity. There may be other things going on, but this is if the oil execs get what they want, this will be the result. That $17 billion number came up for me in another context. I did a study that was published in December looking at the costs for British Columbia of the extreme weather disasters we saw in 2021. So the heat dome back in late June, early July, the summer wildfires in the aftermath of that, and then the November flooding and landslides. You could argue that they are all one contiguous disaster, but we broke them down into three, and we tallied all of the economic costs associated with that. So not just the insured damages, which is what you generally hear in the media, but non-insured damages, costs to government, lost income for workers. And the range, we had to put a range on it, was like about between 11 and $17 billion for that 1 year. So compare that, $17 billion is sort of the damages that could come from the Northern Gateway Pipeline every year. Like essentially putting this pipeline in service is like creating a 2021 British Columbia around the world every year for as long as it's in operation. Now, it doesn't obviously operate as linearly as that, and there's a lot of guesswork around the numbers, but I think those numbers are substantial. 17 billion comes up in another context as well. Some work done by an economist named Robin Allen estimated that that's what Canadian taxpayers will be on the hook for when it's all said and done of these cost overruns, that we're just going to have to forgive that debt to make this pipeline commercially viable. So we're into big numbers here. Site C is only at $16 billion. So I figured that could have rounded it out, but we're not going to go there. What are the benefits? I mean, there are costs, but sure, there's benefits, right? We created jobs, lots. So we created about 7,000 jobs in BC during the construction phase, and they saved 13,000 if you include Alberta. So I mean, those are really well-paying jobs. They're short-term, but they're construction. If the pipeline leads to additional production, there will be additional royalties and additional tax revenues that will flow primarily to the Alberta government, but also federally. Another rationale for the pipeline is that it will diversify. It'll give Canada additional markets to ship our oil to, and this will lead to higher profits for oil companies because we can tap these lucrative Asian markets. Unfortunately, that doesn't really hold together when you look at it. We've been working with a geoscientist named David Hughes, who's looking at these factors. And so when you factor that, the equivalent of Canadian heavy oil is sold at a discount in Asia because they don't have the same refining capacity. And mostly the industry actually wants to go into the Gulf Coast. That's where all the major refining capacity for Canadian heavy oil is. And then you factor in the transportation costs of getting there. So basically, for every barrel they sold in Asia, they'd be losing $4 to $6 compared to if they just sold it into the United States. So the illusion of Asia, the whole narrative that we were sold as a justification for this pipeline is really not holding up. I'm out of time, but I'll leave you with one final thought, is that You know, TMX is essentially the most ill-suited project to the current moment of climate change and climate disasters in terms of its cost. It will be a 1,150 kilometer monument to a bygone era of fossil fuels. And it also shows us just how industry and government, in spite of rhetoric of net zero and climate action plans, for which we've done a lot better on, are still really clinging to fossil fuel exports and expansion as part of their vision for the future of the country. Thank you.
Let's go to Erin and Chloe next.
Great, thank you. Great, so my name is Erin Hansen. I work as a policy advisor for the Tsleil-Waututh Nation and manager of the Sacred Trust Initiative in the Treaty Lands and Resources Department of Tsleil-Waututh. And so I imagine most of you are somewhat familiar with some of the work we've done, but I just would like to kind of tell you a little bit about the Tsleil-Waututh Nation and situate sort of where we are. So first of all, I do want to acknowledge I am a settler Canadian. I'm of European descent. I grew up along the banks of the Fraser River in the core of Musqueam territory. And I now live in the shared territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And like I said, I've been working at Tsleil-Waututh for just over a decade now. And so I've learned so much along that way, and including from Elder Margaret and Bear. Just want to acknowledge you being here, and thanks again for the opening words. And so Tsleil-Waututh Nation is one of the 3 nations that call Vancouver home. Their reserve community is based on the North Shore, kind of if you've been to Deep Cove, sort of in that area. And when we stand here downtown Vancouver, we're looking across the water, Canada Place, gazing across the North Shore Mountains. We are standing on the shores of Burrard Inlet, and that is the heart of Tsleil-Waututh territory. Tsleil-Waututh means people of the inlet, and that gives us a sense of just how deeply rooted that relationship is. Tsleil-Waututh elders will share that the first groundmother was made from the sediment of the inlet. So again, this is where the creation stories are from, and so this is a very deep, long-standing relationship. And Tsleil-Waututh has lived in and governed these lands and waters since time out of mind. And so because Tsleil-Waututh, among other First Nations, have been obviously living and working and having these governance and laws governing their territories since that time out of mind, that is the source of where they have inherent Indigenous rights and inherent governance rights. And so those are recognized and protected in the Canadian Constitution. And I recognize this is probably review for some folks, but again, I just wanted to provide this this background to then kind of give you a sense as to where the relationship between interfacing between Crown governments and a First Nation like Tsleil-Waututh kind of comes from. So because Aboriginal rights are constitutionally protected in Canada, Crown governments, so the province and the federal government, have a legal duty to consult when they're contemplating a decision to contemplating a decision that might impact their Indigenous rights or title or interests. So that includes, of course, development projects, resource extraction. And so the consultation process is just one way that Tsleil-Waututh entered into dialogue with the Canadian government over the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And I think when we again think to where Tsleil-Waututh is located, sorry, I think I skipped over an important part. I'm kind of getting used to speaking in front of an audience again. It's been a few years, so a little nervous. When I said the reserve community, I also meant to acknowledge we often conflate the reserve with the territory, and that's not, I want to make sure we're making a distinction there. That's where the reserve community is based, but the Tsleil-Waututh Nation territory encompasses, again, much of the lower mainland, you know, beyond the North Shore Mountains. Oh, do we have a slide? Oh yeah, sorry, thank you. I didn't realize this was up.
This one, I think you got that.
The next,
There we go.
wonderful, thank you. See, I'm out of practice here. So yeah, this is a map of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation consultation area, and it's more or less a depiction of the territory based on where Tsleil-Waututh members have used the lands and resources. Very much a snapshot in time over the course of a few years. This map was done up based on interviews with folks who have been using the territory. So you can see how it really encompasses so much of where we live. If we know that the reserve is here. This is the second narrowest bridge. And then if we're in downtown Vancouver, we're right here. So you can see just how far reaching the territory is. So anything that happens within this black boundary, the provincial or federal governments need to bring that to Slowtith for consultation. And so obviously there's a lot of different resource development projects that we can imagine are happening here. Everything from, I mean, the kinds of projects that get referred to Slowtith vary from quite benign kind of small things, maybe a ditch realignment, a dock replacement, or of course, pipelines perhaps. So I just wanted to situate us again. So just so that then as we talk about the ways that the Slowtith Nation are impacted by the proposed Trans Mountain or the Trans Mountain pipeline, we kind of understand just again the depth of that relationship and the range of impacts. So Slowtith has in the Treaty Lands and Resources Department, we have quite a robust team of environmental scientists, cultural knowledge holders, archaeologists, policy analysts, just a wide range of folks who review these kinds of projects and assess what the impacts would be and try to work with levels of government to explore what might be some alternative ways to kind of, you know, if projects are happening, are there ways that we can avoid impacts? Are there ways we can mitigate impacts? And the Trans Mountain Pipeline really posed impacts that just posed a risk that are too great to accept. And so the nation commissioned a series of expert analyses, expert reports from world-leading experts on oil spill risk, oil spill cleanup, health, and put this together in the nation's own impact assessment. So this was quite unique in that it was Slowtith as a nation, as a sovereign government, conducting these analyses under its own laws, in accordance with its own laws, and coming to a conclusion. And so through this assessment, we were able to make a recommendation to Chief and Council, identified the risks, and Chief and Council said, right, this is just poses too great a risk to the nation. And those impacts that we're concerned about, I think, are very familiar to the group here. The risk of oil spills, the inability to adequately clean them up, the risk of ecological disaster in the event of a spill. Of course, we know the impacts that it would pose to the southern resident killer whales, for example. So there's a lot in there that we speak to. And I think the thing with the consultation process, though, is that when we enter into dialogue with Crown governments, the way that this legal obligation for consultation is currently set up, it still is quite a colonial system in that the Crown still retains the ultimate decision-making power. And so while we try to engage in a government-to-government relationship, in a nation-to-nation relationship, which, as we know, is really the nature of the relationship between First Nations and the federal government, it's not really reflected in the consultation process because these decisions are still ultimately Crown decisions that then the nation's feedback gets subsumed under. So we can present this as a decision that the nation made as a standalone government, but it was accepted by the National Energy Board as just evidence that gets put sort of under what is ultimately a Crown decision-making authority. At that time, they just didn't know what to do with this. That's sort of my very oversimplified summary, but I think they just didn't know what to do with it because, again, these systems haven't been set up to have a First Nation and another level of government at the table as equal decision makers. And so I know, again, my time is running out here, but something that I want when I think of hidden costs, I was reflecting on this dynamic and these processes that we engage in. And I think, you know, it made me reflect on a discussion we had during the consultation phase over the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And in 2019, we had a series of meetings with the federal government where we were trying to convey our concerns about the impacts that this project posed, how they would impact Slowtith, and try to discuss that with the federal government to find out what ways could we move forward here. And there was a day devoted to the impacts on whales. And I remember waking up that day feeling that pressure and just recognizing the absurdity of setting aside a 6-hour time frame in one meeting that we're going to convey all this information and come up with some way to move forward. It just didn't seem right that such an immense responsibility would be able to be done justice in that kind of framing. And so what we did was we were meeting with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and certain folks from different ministries in the federal government. And we had been going over some of the relationship that Tsleil-Waututh has with the killer whales. And so we were explaining the importance of the whales to the nation. We were explaining to them how for Tsleil-Waututh, and I know this is also other Coast Salish nations have this relationship as well, whales have shown up in the inlet at times that really key times, really key moments. And I've been taught that when whales can come at times when they are conveying important messages. And we hadn't seen killer whales in the inlet up as far as Second Narrows, which is where Tsleil-Waututh's community is, since the 90s. And we're explaining this to the federal representatives across the table from us. And they were listening and they were really interested. But I think the way that they were receiving this information was more of this sense of this is a piece of cultural information. This is really interesting. This is really cool to hear about. You have this important relationship with whales. That's a really cool cultural fact. But what we were trying to convey was that Tsleil-Waututh people have a reciprocal legal responsibility to the whales, and the whales in turn have a legal responsibility to Tsleil-Waututh people. And with this kind of resource development projects that happen in the territory that prevent whales from discourage whales or are harmful for whales coming into the inlet, then that relationship is put at risk, and that relationship is at risk of being severed. And Tsleil-Waututh can't uphold its legal obligations. And just as we were trying to convey that, and we weren't sure it was getting through. And then as we were about to break for lunch, one of our colleagues, his phone beeped, and it was a text message from somebody from the Squamish Nation. And they said, hey, look out your window. The whales are coming up. The whales are swimming up the inlet, and they should be approaching the Second Narrows about now. And I tell you, yeah, we just froze. We couldn't quite, I still get shivers thinking about it. And I think in that moment, we actually then were able to share that with these folks sitting across the table. And they also were incredibly moved. And in that moment, I think they did catch that glimpse of what it means to have this dynamic, multifaceted, sophisticated legal governance relationship, where it's not just a matter of providing information for other governments to make decisions on your behalf. These are a whole complex set of laws and resource management systems, and I think that all gets very much flattened when we look at it in this very much like Canadian law informed consultation process. And so I remember them sitting there reflecting, saying, how can we take this back to Ottawa? How can we convey this? I don't know how we're going to do it. So I think, when we think about reconciliation initiatives, there's a lot of wonderful discussion right now with UNDRIP, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. A lot of conversations are shifting towards what does it mean for land back, right? There's a lot of refreshed energy. And I think there are some really good intentions from various levels of government to see how can we advance this. And I think that when we think about the things we could achieve through different reconciliation negotiations, if we're talking about restoring those governance rights and those governance systems to First Nations, when we have these really long-term negotiations about making things different, setting up these new systems, what does that mean when these pipelines are being pushed forward? And what does it mean when we explore hypothetically, okay, if we imagine what does land back mean? Could it mean restoring or returning this decision-making authority back to Tsleil-Waututh over key parts of their territory, over issues and decisions that matter most to them? Are we returning a completely degraded ecosystem? Are we returning something that doesn't hold that same integrity that it had? So Tsleil-Waututh is actively working hard to restore the health of the territory so that doesn't happen. But I just like to reflect on that. So when I think of hidden costs, that's more the angle that I'm coming at it from, working in sort of policy and governance arena. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Hi, I'm Chloe Huntley. There are 2 seats up here. People can maybe squeeze in here and there.
A few in the middle as well.
Yeah, and it's really great to see so many people out. Yeah, I'm Chloe Hartley. I'm also a settler and I work with Aaron on the Sacred Trust team. Our community member spokespeople, part of our team, Charlene Aleck and Ruben George weren't able to speak here tonight, so we're filling in for them. And yeah, like Aaron, the hidden cost that I will be briefly speaking about is that enduring impact of consent denied has had and will continue to have on Tsleil-Waututh Nation as a result of this pipeline project. Tsleil-Waututh Nation has already experienced a cascade of development decisions without their consent. There's actually already 6 existing industrial oil facilities across the water in Broward Inlet, just across from Tsleil-Waututh Nation. An oil refinery, several oil tank farms, and their pipeline and shipping accessories, including the original Trans Mountain pipeline. And when each of these projects were built, Tsleil-Waututh was not consulted. Tsleil-Waututh did not give their consent to these projects. And with the Trans Mountain project, suddenly there's this opportunity for consultation. Tsleil-Waututh did this amazing assessment, identified a bunch of serious concerns with the project, but the government approved the project without answering Tsleil-Waututh's concerns in the conditions, and approved the project without Tsleil-Waututh's consent. And these existing projects have already impacted, brought great cumulative impacts to the territory, where Tsleil-Waututh's rights, capacity to express their rights to gather safe, abundant food in their territory is already constrained. And as Aaron mentioned, Tsleil-Waututh has this obligation, this reciprocal responsibility to protect and restore their territory so that they can practice their culture, they can harvest food safely. In the past, the majority of the community's food came from the inlet, but these developments have resulted in, the salmon are no longer in the creeks, in the local creeks. DFO closed shellfish harvesting in the inlet 50 years ago because of contamination. It's been 50 years since, more than 50 years since Tsleil-Waututh has been able, the community members have been able to go out there and harvest, gather clams in their front yards. And also the community has worked really hard all these years to resist these projects and to restore the territory. They have been cleaning up contamination in Burrard Inlet, removing creosote piles, restoring creeks, restoring estuaries, creating a Burrard Inlet action plan, doing painstaking work with trying to research existing contaminant levels and developing safe thresholds in Burrard Inlet water quality objectives. So they've been working really hard to bring back their rights so they can exercise that way of life in the territory. But as long as Trans Mountain goes forward, it's very hard to see a future where clams could be harvested again. By any measure, the safe thresholds have already been crossed from the existing development. And Trans Mountain, of course, is bringing a whole new load of impacts on the tanker traffic. Obviously, right now there's approximately 3 ships per month that transit in and out of Burrard Inlet, but it will be over 440. So every single day there will be a tanker coming in and out. So huge risk of spill, but also a new pathway for contaminants, new oil spill accidents like just happened in English Bay this weekend. Invasive species coming in, other pollutants coming from the hulls of the ship, light pollution, which actually has an impact on, affects marine life, affects marine birds, noise pollution, air pollution. I can't remember the exact number, but it's something like, it's ridiculously high number. 1 in 6 or 1 in 5 deaths worldwide is from air pollution from the burning of oil and gas. There was just or from petrochemicals, carbon-based fuels. There's just an article this week about that I read about how just being exposed to diesel fuel for a couple hours impacts your brain. So there will be 3 to 5 tankers mooring every day in the inlet. Already when there are tankers there, you can see this haze of exhaust from the bunker fuel from their generators. So air pollution, water pollution, light pollution, noise pollution, and even the shoreline, cultural sites, archaeological sites, the actual front yards of the community is at risk of eroding from the increase of wake from the tankers and the tugboat, so each tanker has 2 tugboats, and the tugboats actually generate significant weight. So, yeah, so essentially, in approving this project without Tsleil-Waututh's consent, in not answering these grave concerns, the community is exposed to real risk of harm. And the enduring hidden cost to me is how the project diminishes the current and future opportunities for Tsleil-Waututh to uphold that obligation, to be able to restore the environment in their territory. And each day that a tanker will cross in front, back and forth, is another example of that consent being broken. So yeah, this one infringement on Tsleil-Waututh's human right, denying that consent, will have enduring impacts on the nation.
Thank you, Chloe and Aaron. Let's go to Eugene next.
Thank you. Thanks to Chloe and Aaron. Thanks to Elder Margaret for starting us in a good way. And it's really an honor to be here, see some familiar faces. Thank you to the organizers as well. I also work with the Tsleil-Waututh Nation Sacred Trusted Initiative, but I'm going to talk a little bit in more detail about something that Marc mentioned, which is the report that Robin Allen authored in September. I had the pleasure of working with Robin and editing it, and then the displeasure of trying to turn a 30-page report into a 3-minute video. And so you're going to see a little clip of that. This is the report itself, and I just a quick note off the top, right? When we think about the balancing act that cabinet made ultimately when it made its decision on Trans Mountain, following the recommendation from the Canadian Energy Regulator, formerly the National Energy Board, that balancing act generally looks at kind of the bad stuff, you know, harms, risk in the environment, taking us in the wrong way in terms of climate, etc., infringing on Indigenous rights, as we've heard. And then it kind of balances it against the good stuff, the justifications, the benefit, and almost always that's economic benefits, right? And so I was looking at this as the cost kept going up and up and up, and thinking, when does this insanity stop? Like, if there is no economic benefit, then there's no justification, in theory, according to their own balancing act, right? Unfortunately, that's not the case. And that's what we found here, digging into publicly available financial reporting. I'll talk a little bit later about how challenging that can be. But at the end of the day, what you need to know, if I can get the next slide, is that when Canada bought Trans Mountain from Kinder Morgan, can I get the next slide, please? Yeah. So when Canada bought Trans Mountain, it was a share purchase, not an asset purchase, meaning they bought the rights to the company and formed their own companies. And of course, owned by the government, it's a crown corporation. And so this is the corporate structure that they set up. It's 6 separate legal entities under CDEV, housed under the CDEV. And the 2 that I really want you to pay attention to is TMP Finance and Trans Mountain Corporation. TMP Finance plays a really important role in how Trans Mountain and Canada is hiding the full financial picture of the company. TMC Corporation, with all subsidiaries, is kind of who's building and operating and running the various pieces. And so I'm going to defer to a younger version of myself to explain the next slide on that video I talked about. Oh, no, I'm just looking at a current version of myself. Here we go. Oh, I had a clip, we need to watch the whole thing.
Remember when the Canadian government bought a pipeline for $4.5 billion?
Well, I'll just tell you when it's
Well,
done.
now it looks like they're preparing to forgive $17 billion of public money loaned to Trans Mountain, and they're hiding it with accounting magic. It's classic sleight of hand, and here's how it works. CDEV is home to 6 Trans Mountain corporations, including TMP Finance and TMC. TMC's financial statements are made public and make things appear profitable. TMP Finance is a classic shell corporation. It buries its books amongst several other crown corporations, hiding Trans Mountain's losses from Canadians. Using accounting magic, TMP Finance took the $15.8 billion it borrowed from the Canadians and transformed it into two parts: equity, an investment that is usually earned and does not require repayment, and debt, a loan that needs to be repaid with interest when it passed the money down to TMC. TMC used this money to buy the 1951 pipeline and to pay for the ballooning construction costs of the expansion. This means that TMP Finance is only collecting interest on about half of the money it owes interest for. And to cover this unpaid interest, TMP Finance has to borrow more money from the Canada account. And as a result, the money owed to Canadians has grown to nearly $17 billion. TMC is doing the same thing, borrowing more to pay for its unpaid interest from TMP Finance. What happened to no more public money for Trans Mountain?
Thank you. We can stop it there.
More accounting magic.
There's more. Please watch it. I almost killed myself trying to compress that into 3 minutes. But really, if we can just get the next slide here, which kind of summarizes that flow of money. You can see how this combination of corporate shells, so TMP Finance being the borrower from the Canada account and then lending that money to TMC, but splitting it using accounting magic, nothing illegal about that, nothing, I mean, it's actually quite common to split it into debt and equity. But what that means is now that interest is not being paid and then to borrow more. So it's going to be approaching $17 billion by the end of this year. And that is partially how we arrived at the number of $17 billion that the federal government is preparing to forgive using a section in the Export Development Act that they can do. That you may remember they did the same with regard to the auto manufacturers in 2008, but that was a measly $2 billion or something. So we have this kind of model, and it's continuing to tick up. You're probably also aware there's the $10 billion syndicated loan that Trans Mountain needed because Minister Freeland promised that no more public money would be spent, even though we know that hundreds of millions of dollars are being added to the balance in interest. An interesting thing about that $10 billion, we've now seen through CDEV's most recent quarterly reports. And yes, I do read them every quarter. It's just so much fun. Those banks, the interest they are earning on this $10 billion loan is 1.85%. So the banks are not even adhering to their own fundamental role and succumbing to basically public political pressure in order to enable this thing to continue. I'll do the next slide, and I'm going to talk about this really quickly because it is really boring. But you're probably familiar with some of the various studies that have been out there. Is this going to be profitable? Is this going to work? Does this commercially viable? And what we saw, we compared in the report 3 different discount cash flow analyses. Discount cash flow is just one way to compare future earnings in a present time. And back in 2012, Kinder Morgan's own analysis, when the thing was 5.4 billion, as Marc mentioned, there are 2 variables that you want to think about in discount cash flow are the rate of return, how much money you're going to earn, and the timeline that you're going to earn that back. Those 2 things will determine whether it's actually going to be viable or not, right? So 2012, Kinder Morgan says 12 to 15% rate of return with a 20-year cutoff period. Pretty reasonable, and for them, they move forward with that. In 2018, when Canada purchased the pipeline, Marc mentioned that the public price was 7.4 billion. It's true that that's what the Canadian government continued to say publicly. We now know through access to information that they were aware that it was 9.3 billion. And in fact, at 9.3 billion, Kinder Morgan's numbers no longer worked. That's why they ran away from the project. But TD Securities did analysis in 2018, and they used a 10-year rate of return, or a 10% rate of return, so a lower rate of return, and a 40-year timeline, which I will, in their defense, is historically has been a plausible timeline for measuring pipelines. I would say today that's in question when you can't guarantee that a new oil pipeline will be used for 40 years, especially in the climate crisis.
In 2022, when the $21.4 billion announcement came out, the parliamentary budget officer did another report. This one you may have seen, or you may remember when they said it would lose $600 million for Canadians. One thing to note about all of these is that they are unlevered discount cash flow. That's basically a fancy way of saying they're not taking into account interest and borrowing obligations, which, you know, as the Canadian public who lent $17 billion, you might hope that they are taken into account. You may also remember around this time last year, February last year, that Minister Freeland announced that TD and BMO had done further analysis and said, oh, don't worry, it's still commercially viable at $21.4 billion. Well, we learned not long afterwards through the parliamentary budget officer who had seen that analysis that they used a 100-year timeline to justify it. That is borderline unprofessional, in my opinion. To put that in other context, imagine if you could get a 100-year mortgage. I could maybe afford a house. Maybe.
Get onto something.
Yeah, so I did actually ask TD for a 100-year mortgage in the summer when we met with them. Didn't work out. Okay, so but really, all you need to know, like the reason I'm showing this is not to bore you to death, but it's to show how these numbers and these analysis can be manipulated in order to get the result you want. And when we talk about the true, like the hidden, what I'm talking about is real costs, right? We forecast that the federal government's going to write off or forgive $17 billion in order to make it workable for if someone buys it, that on paper it'll work for them potentially. And a lot of that is due to the tolls, which I'm not going to get into. But what I want to get into in terms of hidden costs is that this example, since 2018, the role of the federal government in cementing Canada's place as a petrostate, the petrostate politics that have followed that. So whether that's convincing the banks to lend $10 billion at 1.85%, the culture of secrecy. I know there have been countless access to information requests and FOIs that have been stonewalled over the years. I mean, I used to look at all Kinder Morgan's securities filings, and you could get way more information when it was owned by Kinder Morgan, the offshoot of Enron, than today when it's owned by the Canadian public. And it should be the exact opposite, right? Of course, we have, all kinds of things. People are aware of the CERG and the surveillance culture and intimidation that's happening. Even the CDEV annual meeting, which I've again been paying attention to, one of the few people maybe in the country since Canada purchased it. In the first year after Canada purchased their annual meeting, they gave you a 1-month window to submit questions to the annual meeting. The next year, after we submitted thousands of questions, they shortened that quietly to 2 weeks. Last year, it was 1 week. This in 2022, it was 2 days. They posted it online. It only happened that I was on their website and they gave a 2-day window to ask questions. I asked a bunch of questions based on this report. And on the day that they were supposed to release the video, they said, we've had technical difficulties and we're not releasing it. And they still have not released their annual report video that was supposed to be in early December. So when we're talking about the hidden costs, we're talking about things that maybe aren't talked about as much. To me, it's the money is important, it matters because people are struggling. But at the end of the day, they're numbers on a spreadsheet that someone's manipulating. The real cost to me that's concerning is the erosion of our democratic institutions to the benefit of the oil and gas companies who are already going to have an additional subsidy of up to $17 billion. I'm sure I've gone way over my time, so I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Eugene and Kevin.
Great. Before you said last and least, and you were right. Yeah, I heard it and I feel it. I've actually really enjoyed the panelists' comments today. I hope we all had this good feeling, good spirit that you referred to. And Eugene, I love that your angriest moment, you'd said it's borderline unprofessional. It's worse than that, but I appreciate that. Yeah. My name's Kevin Cromar. I professor at New York University. I'm a health researcher, but we work between scientific research and policy. And I just want to make a few quick points and we get to Tim as quick as we can. The first point I'd like to make is when you set out to make decisions and you're a private firm or a private company or a publicly traded company, you have a certain set of criteria you're working through for what makes sense, what's a good investment. When you're making public decisions, there should be a different set of criteria you use. And I think it's clear from this type of project, those were not separated out. They use the criteria you'd expect from a private company or a private investor. They didn't consider what's really important in public decision making. And we can distill that down into two broad areas. The first is in public decision making, we need to be much more conscious about broad economic impacts. What are all the costs? What are all the benefits? And I think we've heard very well today that was not done effectively. The second piece of public decision making that goes hand in hand with the economic analysis is the equity considerations. Who benefits? Who pays? And I think we've also heard tonight that that was not taken into account very well. Let me make a quick second point, which is as we think about climate policies in general, whether it's increasing greenhouse gas emissions and trying to justify the benefit that might come from that, or where it's asking the question, well, how aggressively should we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? What you're really asking about is, let's do the reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That feels better to talk about. How much should we spend now to reduce those emissions in order to reduce future damages, to reduce future adaptation costs? That's the real economic calculation that needs to take place. That's how you do it qualitatively. Quantitatively, we can put numbers to that. Marc spoke about the social cost of carbon. I think Tim invited me here tonight because I was part of the health group that helped generate these new values that are being used. And in a moment, if there's questions, we can show a few slides to show you what that looks like. But we can actually assign a good estimate to the dollar amount for how much greenhouse gas emissions will occur. And we can put that in dollar terms that we can compare carefully. The last point I'd like to make real quickly, then I'll turn it over to Tim. Discussion of this pipeline, I think, is probably triggering for many people here. And that's good. I'm glad you're here, even though you're being triggered a little bit. It made me think about a project back where I'm from. It's a large infrastructure project, and they had more public comments they've ever had for any project, 18,000 public comments or something like that. But the agency who was responsible for making the decision, who are going to move ahead no matter what was said, they used this heavy public engagement as if it was support for their predetermined decision. Like, after a rigorous process, we've had more involvement we've ever had on any project, we've come up with this conclusion. I think it seems like no matter what you do, it comes back to bite you. And so I sympathize with anyone who this is triggering for, and I'm just glad we have great leaders who can help speak words to your feelings. With that, I'll turn it, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. It's going to be your turn very soon, but Tim is going to have the honor of asking a first question to the panel. And if the panelists try to be as concise as they can, we can then get to the questions that are already pouring in online. So Tim.
Well, thank you very much. And I know there are a lot of good questions out there. So the panelists have an opportunity to respond to this, each one. You make the costs of Trans Mountain pipeline expansion look quite clear, but it seems to not be easy for everyone to see it. And I'm curious about what part of your perspective you feel is hardest for people to accept and why. Particularly, why does it appear that the Canadian government does not understand and include the costs that you refer to? So maybe, Kevin, you were brief. Why don't we start with you and we'll just go down the line.
Okay, you guys can match my brevity if you'd like. I'm going to use a hockey analogy if it's okay. If you're the GM of the Canucks, it's not a great year, I apologize. The decisions you make about trading players or trading picks, you're not going to trade for picks you're not going to be around to make yourself. You're making decisions that's good for you right now. And So sometimes it's not always about not looking at the cost. Sometimes it's not your cost to deal with, and so you don't make optimal public decisions. So that would be my hockey analogy for Tim's question.
Great.
I'll go to like a non-benefit instead of a cost, and that is the whole story we were told about Asian markets. You know, that the whole justification for this was to ship our product to Asia, big and proud and stuff. But really, like most of that would probably go to the United States, to California. It would still get on a tanker. And it would just be processed in California, because California is not is disconnected from the rest of the United States oil and gas networks. So as David Hughes did this great report, which came out in fall of 2020, where he looks at that case and compares equivalent quality crudes and what they would fetch in Asia, and then adjusting for transportation costs, and basically finds there's no big windfall to be found in Asia, unfortunately.
I'll tell a story. When I was articling many years ago, one of the first hearings I attended was a procedural hearing at the BC Utilities Commission in a matter between Rio Tinto Alcan and the Carriers County Tribal Council. That ended up all the way at the Supreme Court of Canada, when the Supreme Court of Canada essentially said regulators like the BCUC, National Energy Board, need to consider the duty to consult when they're making their decisions. This was a new responsibility. And while that was a victory, I think, in the big picture, I then saw in real time these regulators, who are primarily comprised of accountants and engineers, because their core function is accounting and engineering, struggling with these questions around reconciliation, around land rights. And I think that continues, and really still see the shift of the mindset and the approach of recognizing Indigenous rights, of recognizing the right to free, prior, informed consent, in spite of the positive political and performative rhetoric. We haven't yet seen that catch up on the governance level.
What he said. No, I think, yeah, I'm reflecting on that. It's a really good question, and I wasn't really sure how to answer it, but I think very much in line with what Eugene said. One of the messages that we tried to convey when we were in dialogue with the federal government back in 2019 and previous years was that we had done our due diligence at Slowta, had they done theirs. And like some folks had commented in so far today, the question to justify for the federal government approving the pipeline is like, is this in the public interest? And like, Eugene spoke on this. Well, I think everyone touched upon this really, is that they claim that they did, but, so while Indigenous rights are constitutionally protected, Canadian law also gives them a complete out, which is that Indigenous rights can also be infringed upon. The only catch is that you have to justify it. And economic benefits in the public interest is a really strong justification. And so that's usually what we hear if there is a project that infringes on Indigenous rights, and they say, well, we can justify it by the economics. And we just don't see that. And as we see these costs ballooning, and really appreciate the work of Eugene and Marc, where, I really struggle to understand the financial picture. And so I do love your graphics and 3-minute videos, but it's very frustrating because they're infringing Indigenous rights, or they're infringing Tsleil-Waututh rights. And they can't the justification that allows them to even open that door and do this is just not there. So that's what I was reflecting on.
Yeah, I would just uphold all those statements that, we still have both that, but also the colonial structure is there. The colonial structure is now the petro state. And so there's still just like a disparity of power and culture, and also racism. So yeah, just more time, more words, more questions.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take a little prerogative here, because I am a physician, and most of you know, and I work in public health. And I was involved in the process from the very beginning, writing reports on the health effects of the project. And I was forbidden from considering the health effects of the emissions, which of course dwarf all of the other health effects, the risk of a spill is real, and it would be incredibly damaging to certainly all the communities of the inlet. It would be devastating to the wildlife. It would be devastating to the entire ecosystem. But we are not considering the costs to future generations at all. We are not considering that the heat dome was terrible. 700 excess deaths here in British Columbia alone. But multiply that by generation upon generation as that 40-year timeline unwinds. The cost to future generations are costs that will haunt us forever. So with that, I think we have some online questions. You're going to moderate that section. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. So as we said, we're going to try to do this democratically. So Melvin has very kindly put up the questions that have been most voted upon. So the first one is there still a path to stop the completion and or operation of TMX, or has the nail gone in the coffin already? So again, maybe if one of you wants to take that one, and it sounds like the next two questions are quite related. So I'm going to take a prerogative like Tim and suggest we merge those next two questions. So who would like to take the first question?
I can, I'll take a stab at it. So when you have a linear piece of infrastructure, like a pipeline, it needs to be 100% complete to be 1% effective. Some of you probably heard me say that before. It's still true. You don't want 99% of a pipeline. It'll spill everywhere. Terrible, terrible pipeline. It needs to be 100% complete. So until it's complete, I think the resistance continues. If, as they're saying, it will be completed by the end of this year or early 2024, it's not like, I mean, we were talking about this internally at Tsleil-Waututh. It then shifts from being a potential threat to an active threat in the territory and to the territory. And so that doesn't change anything about the opposition to it. It perhaps changes the tactics that you may use in order to express that opposition. But also, if we think about, I mean, there's two pathways. If you look at what the IEA has been saying in terms of the future of oil and gas, the reality or the likely scenario is that it will not be used or paid off, which is a problem for whoever owns it. Or if it is, then we'll have a lot of other problems that we're going to be dealing with in terms of the climate crisis. So that's for me how I'm thinking about it right now. And yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't change anything about the threat that it poses. And in fact, if anything, it makes it more present.
So the next question we had was, can we still reconcile First Nation sovereignty and the anti-pipeline struggle when band councils approve pipeline projects?
That's a tricky one for should I try?
Well, okay. I mean, I think there are some assumptions in that question that I want to be really mindful of. I think that, you know, Chloe and I work for Tsleil-Waututh. We only can speak from that perspective, and also recognizing we're not community members. We are very clearly speaking as a staff for Tsleil-Waututh. And so, you know, each nation is going to have a different scenario, different considerations. And we see that across BC. There's some very prominent current events that bring some of these questions into the picture. So I don't know, sorry, I took a little photo here so I could kind of refer back to it. Yeah, I mean, I think when we look at, if I'm sort of understanding the question correctly, then if we're talking about First Nation sovereignty, I mean, First Nation sovereignty is the ability, part of that includes the ability to make decisions about how you use the lands and waters, and how what does your community need? And how does a nation balance those considerations? And that really, that's really going to be up to that nation. And so, it would be nice to have a nice tidy answer that can be a blueprint for all, but that's just not the reality. So I just have to acknowledge that.
I'll add something quickly. So, I think as we've seen in the Coastal GasLink dispute, reliance on bound council approvals alone is not going to get industry or government and their investors the certainty that they think it will. And so there's two pieces that I would just add to what Aaron said. One is look to the indigenous legal traditions of that nation, of the nations who it's being impacted by, not just band councils, which are a construct of Canadian law. But also, if we think about the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, right? And this is a great example that's slavery assessment. I can't imagine a nation being more informed, making themselves more informed than what Tsleil-Waututh engaged in. But I want to focus on the free part. That means free from interference, free from essentially like the ability to make that choice without duress. And that is very difficult to do in a resource project when First Nations under Canadian law continue to control 0.2% of the land. That's a number from Art Manual. Some of you may be familiar with it, but it comes back to what Aaron was talking about land back. Absolutely, sovereignty includes the ability to say no and to say yes and to make those decisions. And we need to accept that and be supportive, especially when nations make yes decisions. But those cannot, if those decisions come under duress because it's the only economic activity that's available, because there's no ability to benefit from the land that is their territory, then I question whether that's really fully free. And so there are many layers tied into that question and many assumptions, but I just want to, I don't think it's quite as straightforward as maybe it's being set out, and I just want to add those extra pieces. Thanks.
Thank you. So I noticed people are voting on these questions now. I'm losing track of where we were. But why don't we go to the next one, which was, if we could stop Enbridge with a mass protest, can't we do the same now? And I feel like Eugene sort of answered that question a little bit earlier. So I'm going to use my MC prerogative again and see if we can go to the next one, which is, how do we deal with the fact that Canada has benefited so little from oil and gas compared to places like Norway? Why don't we have a sovereign wealth fund? So maybe Marc on this one?
Wow, that's a
retroactive sovereign outcome. How can we do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I mean, the conversation we need to be having right now is how quickly can we wind down the oil and gas industry so that we are consistent with the 1.5 degrees. The reality is that most oil and gas reserves around the world are publicly controlled, managed by state owned enterprises and governments. Canada is one of the only places in the world where private capital can get in and claim stakes and produce. That's why we're all here. And that's why the arguments that, oh, we're going to take our investments somewhere else is garbage. So yeah, I think with all due respect, that's the wrong question. That ship has sailed. There's not a whole lot we can do. I mean, we can increase royalties, we can increase taxes, we can impose a windfall or excess profits taxes on the industry, particularly right now when they're making insane profits. There's no reason why we couldn't do those things to claim more back. In fact, we may even, in order to have an orderly wind down of the industry, we may need to think about nationalization in certain areas. I don't know that capitalism is compatible with the type of wind down that we need.
Okay, so we're back from the question of UNDRIP, I think. Does the passage of UNDRIP into federal and provincial law create any new legal opportunities for Tsleil-Waututh to challenge the TMX expansion?
I guess I'll answer that.
For Chloe and Aaron.
Okay. I'll support my colleagues here. So the DRIPA bill, the provincial legislation that adopts the UN declaration, doesn't actually make it apply right away. It's a framework to bring over time BC laws in accordance with the UN declaration. So to the bill itself doesn't necessarily give you specific tools, legal tools today. However, that is being used today in litigation in other contexts. Some of you may be familiar with the Gitsala legal challenge to BC's gold rush era mineral tenure regime. This is the regime that, okay, this piece of it isn't gold rush, but if you have a credit card and internet access, you can lay stake mineral to claims anywhere in the province without consulting anyone, whether it's, I remember back in the day, I think it was Bev Sellers laid a claim on the Minister of Mining's house, just to prove the point, right? So that, that's being challenged right now in BC Supreme Court. My colleague, Gavin Smith is one of the several lawyers working on it. And the UN, the DRIPA bill is part of that challenge as a reason that antiquated law needs to change.
Great. I'm mindful of time, so maybe we'll take the next question and then we'll give our speakers an opportunity for some thoughts before we close on. But this is a question maybe for those of you who are educators as well. How do you think we can manage the overwhelming and complex information in order to translate the hidden costs for K-12 education to make it more accessible? Kevin, I see you scratching your chin. Any ideas?
I'm not the right person to answer this question. I have kids, 3 kids in K-12 ages, and whenever they want to talk about something along these lines, I say, let's go skiing or let's go do something. At some point, they got to engage with the world. I don't know if my kids at their age need to engage with these topics. That's why I'm not the right person to answer this to.
Have some ideas? I haven't thought a lot about this, but I think there's so many lessons or like important values that you can bring forth in this about racism, Indigenous rights, and climate change. So there's like an endless amount of opportunities to educate children on bigger, broader lessons, as maybe not just like pro pipeline or anti pipeline, but all of the discussions that go into a resource project where there's different sides provides a really good learning environment or a good opportunity for people to learn. But yeah,
Let's go skiing and talk about First Nation sovereignty.
We at the CCPA we published a bunch of curriculum materials out of our climate justice project, mostly more positive, like forward looking about how we make change in different aspects, whether it's like zero waste or electricity or buildings and that kind of stuff. So I think there are materials out there that are age appropriate and that can get kids talking and thinking about these things.
So maybe an extra challenge for educators in the room to think about. So I know we could spend all night asking questions and continue on this wonderful conversation, but our time is almost up, and I wanted to give all our speakers an opportunity for 2-minute reflections to leave us with as we continue out in the world and maybe continue working on our activism on these issues.
I would say 30 seconds to follow up on Tim's last point. He said, when Marc shared the estimates of how much additional greenhouse gases will be emitted because of this project, times it by that social cost of carbon number, he came up with $17 billion. Just what was that?
Per year.
Yeah, per year. Let me just tell you what that number means. If you break it down, half of that is health impacts. And sometimes you hear these models, they go out for hundreds of years of impacts, and that's true, but the dollar amount is actually driven by near-term impacts because future impacts are discounted. The economists can tell you more about that if you want to hear. But these are impacts that happen now. It's large, and half of those dollars, they're health impacts. And we should be more thoughtful of that, not just royalty payments or what's good for politicians or people in Alberta. So thank you.
It's tough times. I mean, I feel I've been working on this stuff for like a really long time now, and I don't really see a whole lot of progress. And whether it's the federal government and the push for pipelines, or the BC government and LNG, and Coastal GasLink is the other big pipeline that we only kind of barely mentioned today. It seems like our governments are as wedded to fossil fuel development is in the thrall of fossil fuel producing companies as much as they have ever been. And I think we have made some progress around climate action in various respects, provincially and federally, but still very modest, and still so much more to go, but no serious conversation about winding down the industry. So I'm not sure, where it goes. Like, I don't know how many more op-eds or tweets or whatever. I mean, that's why I have such admiration for Tim, that the way to win is on the streets, as it was when the Enbridge fight was at its peak. And we kind of crested at a really high level there. And I think we need to find the organizing momentum to make politicians do the things that they don't want to do, because it's politically difficult for them right now.
Yeah, I agree that it's almost entirely political. The legal arguments, the economic arguments, they're all just feeder into that political piece. And we are all part of that process. So find where you fit in that process and keep hammering away at that. I started talking about the balance that the cabinet and the NEB supposedly made between the good stuff and the bad stuff. And what we now see with Trans Mountain especially is that those economic benefits are non-existent. And so we're now in a place where it feels like Canada is just threatening the environment and infringing on Indigenous rights and taking us in the wrong way in terms of climate, out of muscle memory rather than out of anything really grounded in reality. And so again, I just come back to this is political more than anything.
Like, they didn't even win any seats in Alberta, like,
Yeah.
after all that.
I mean, maybe trying to be a little bit of a optimist here. I think it's easy to come away from this and be kind of feeling a bit deflated, especially when we watch construction on the West Ridge Marine Terminal from across the waters from Tsleil-Waututh Reserve, and that's really difficult. But I think Chloe and I have had some really good conversations, and with our colleagues, with Charlene Aleck and Ruben George and Gabriel George and our whole team, just trying to answer those questions that actually came up of, well, what does it mean now? And I appreciate Eugene had commented earlier about, well, if this pipeline continues to be constructed out, like, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden we just walk away. And I think what some of the conversations that we've reflected on, like, it doesn't mean that we're suddenly going to be like, well, I guess this is just how it is now. We also recognize that there are other forces that will continue to shape this world and these projects. And maybe it is a bit optimistic here, but I do think there's so much more that is happening in terms of climate policy and climate regulations. Obviously, these market forces we've been talking about. We like to think that there are there's all these different forces that might contribute to rendering this pipeline obsolete, regardless of what infrastructure is currently physically there on the ground. And I guess I just think too, obviously I've been thinking a lot about talking about Indigenous rights and title and what that means in practice. And, following the Sokoteen decision in 2014, it really clarified, the Supreme Court of Canada clarified that following a title claim, that a right included in that is the exclusive right of a First Nation to decide how that land is used, and that right to benefit from those uses, including the right to the enjoyment of the land for future generations. And so for me, I always am so, again, a big lesson that I've learned that's humbled me is watching how Tsleil-Waututh has invited the community of the inlet, other levels of government, other jurisdictions, community members, to join them in restoring the health of the inlet and saying, you know what, you can join us if you want to, but regardless, even if you think this is just an aspiration, we're going to do it anyway. And that's an example of Tsleil-Waututh law in action. Tsleil-Waututh members are still upholding that obligation regardless of these other decisions that get made, and that's not going to change. And just, I'm so inspired when we see the return of the whales now in recent years. We see the return of the herring for the first time in 130 years. No, 150 years?
Yeah, it's around 150.
150 years, like the 1880s. Like this is, we're watching this happen over just the past 3 or 4 years. And so the work that the nation has been doing for decades, we see these very tangible effects. And so I just remember to keep that bigger picture in mind. And that is really what keeps me still optimistic about what we can influence and what the future holds.
I think that's a really lovely thing to take away, I think, at the night. But I also want to say that I'm hoping that this event itself is reciprocally inspiring, because to have like 45 people on Zoom and over 50 people here tonight, that also is what keeps me going. And that is like, yeah, there's not a lot of movement, but people after 10 years, there's still 100 people coming out on a Thursday night. So this project, Resistance's project, is not going away. And I think that this change is happening. Thank you.
Some homework for all of you in the audience and those folks watching us online. We want to encourage you to continue the dialogue. The conversation doesn't stop here. If you've heard information, you can share it with others. We would encourage you to continue discussing with friends, family, people who may not be of the same opinion, and continue this dialogue with them. So really encourage you to do that. As we close off, I think some of our speakers have agreed to hang out for a few minutes if you want to grab some more treats outside and continue the discussion with them. And for the folks online, we're just posting right now all the reports that were mentioned tonight. We will also send these by email as a follow-up, as well as the video that Eugene shared with us. So you'll be able to do that. And as we close off, we want to thank some of the people who supported this event tonight, the SFU Institute for the Humanities, Protect the Planet, CCPA, of course, SFU 350, and the Slowitech Sacred Trust. Again, this is a team effort, so we want to thank also our tech host, Melvin, who's in the back there. Functioning. And thank all of you mostly for coming out tonight. As Chloe said, on a rainy night, people are still coming, so it's wonderful to see human faces again. So big thank you to you all, and I'll leave Tim for the last word tonight.
My last word will just be thanks to Elodie and the WASC Center for stepping up here. One of the things that has been missing from the last several years working to stop this project is the mainstream media. I don't know if there's any media here tonight. I hope you will identify yourself. And this is a big problem for democracy. When we have a project with these deficiencies clearly identified as costing billions and billions of dollars to Canadian taxpayers and thousands of lives in the future, but it is not news. This is the largest public works project in Canadian history, but it's not news. That's a problem. So I hope you will use the recording tonight, use your resources that we have here, and find yourself a good journalist to have coffee with and help them understand this threat to democracy, which is real. And thank you to all the panelists and to Elder Margaret for welcoming us in a good way, and to all of the audience.